They took Daniel Brooks's child without a trial, without an accusation, and without ever requiring proof of harm. It did not begin with shouting, violence, or emergency. It began quietly, with a decision made far from his home, inside a system that described itself as protective. The most dangerous form of power is not the one that threatens or intimidates, but the one that signs a document and calls it precaution. Daniel believed that stability was built through consistency. His life was structured around predictability, not ambition. As a warehouse supervisor in a mid-sized American city, his income was modest but reliable. His schedule was fixed. His priorities were clear. Everything revolved around providing safety, routine, and presence for his child. There had never been an allegation of abuse. There had never been an investigation prompted by harm. Daniel trusted that institutions existed to support families like his, especially when no danger had ever been identified. That trust did not collapse in a courtroom. It collapsed on an ordinary weekday. While Daniel was at work performing the same duties he had performed for years, an administrative review was initiated elsewhere. There was no notice sent to him, no request for clarification, no attempt to gather context. The review was procedural, routine, and fast. A caseworker accessed Daniel's digital file as part of a standard workload assessment. The system valued efficiency. Cases were processed in volume, not depth. Daniel's file contained nothing extraordinary. It recorded a prior workplace injury that had required time off. It noted a missed appointment caused by mandatory overtime. It included an address correction that had not yet propagated through every internal database. None of these details suggested danger. None indicated neglect. None pointed toward harm. Yet the system did not evaluate them individually. They were aggregated. Risk assessments were standardized to minimize subjectivity. In doing so, they replaced understanding with probability. The algorithm elevated Daniel's profile into a higher risk category, not because something had happened, but because the model suggested something might. Probability was treated as precaution, and precaution was treated as justification. A supervisor reviewed the classification briefly. The review took minutes, not hours. The system's recommendation was trusted. Questioning it would slow throughput. Slowing throughput created backlog. Backlog reflected inefficiency. Efficiency was rewarded. Depth was not measured. The recommendation advanced. A legal liaison prepared a removal order citing statutory precautionary authority. The language was neutral, technical, and carefully structured to avoid explicit accusation. The order framed the action as temporary, reversible, and in the best interest of the child. It did not acknowledge the absence of verified harm. It did not require corroboration. The final step required a signature. The official who applied it was judicially authorized. The badge associated with that authority symbolized child welfare enforcement. The signature did not require a hearing. It did not require testimony. It did not require Daniel's participation. It required confidence in the process. That confidence was institutional. The signature was applied within minutes. With that act, probability became certainty. A classification became a directive. Language transformed administrative assumption into legal reality. The order carried enormous weight, not because it had been proven necessary, but because it had been authorized. Daniel was not notified before the decision was finalized. When he learned of it, there was no explanation offered. He was informed that protective action had been taken under statutory authority. The phrasing avoided blame while implying inevitability. There was no acknowledgement of doubt, no recognition of error. Authority had acted and action justified itself. By the end of that day, Daniel's home was empty. Daniel believed the decision had to be a mistake. That belief was not rooted in denial or panic, but in logic. He assumed that once someone reviewed the full context of his life, the separation would be reversed quickly. Institutions, he believed, corrected obvious errors. Systems, he thought, valued facts once they were presented clearly. What Daniel did not yet understand was that the system was not designed to reassess humanity. It was designed to confirm procedure. The moment the removal order was signed, the process shifted. The question was no longer whether the decision was correct, but whether the next steps were followed. Timelines activated automatically. Review dates were generated based on caseload volume, not urgency of impact. Every delay was explained as procedural necessity. Language softened responsibility, converting harm into scheduling. Daniel was told future hearings would address his concerns, future evaluations would allow him to submit documentation, future reviews would determine the outcome. None of these processes addressed the present reality, that the separation had already occurred without a full review of facts. The system distinguished between immediate safety actions and subsequent evaluation. This distinction justified urgency without scrutiny. Immediate action did not require certainty. Certainty, the system argued, could come later. Time was positioned as neutral, yet it was anything but. Each day that passed hardened the decision's legitimacy. Duration substituted for evidence. Daniel attempted to ask questions. He wanted to understand what specific concern justified the removal. He asked what allegation had been made, what risk had been identified, what evidence had been reviewed. His inquiries were acknowledged politely and redirected procedurally. He was told to focus on compliance rather than clarification. Inquiry was treated as delay. Judicial authority reinforced this structure. The badge associated with the court did not invite engagement. It signaled finality. Decisions were issued based on documentation completeness, not accuracy. If a file appeared sufficient, it advanced. If information was missing, it was not questioned. Absence of context was interpreted as irrelevance or something to be addressed later. This reliance on incomplete information was protected by doctrine. Judges were permitted to act on what was presented, not on what might exist elsewhere. Responsibility for completeness was distributed across departments. Intake handled classification. Supervisors approved recommendations. Legal liaisons prepared orders. Judicial officials authorized action. Each step trusted the previous one. Accountability dissolved into workflow. What stabilized Daniel most was the absence of hostility. No one accused him directly. No one expressed anger or suspicion. The system operated with calm professionalism. Procedure replaced judgment, and judgment replaced empathy. Authority did not need to be cruel, it only needed to be consistent. As days turned into weeks, Daniel's position within the system changed. He was no longer regarded primarily as a parent seeking correction. He became a case under management. His name was replaced by reference numbers. His communications were logged rather than addressed. The system did not see a family disrupted, it saw milestones pending. It was during this phase that the label fully attached itself. The removal order had done more than separate Daniel from his child. It had assigned him a classification. That classification existed independently of evidence, circulating through databases, court schedules, and administrative notes. It did not accuse him explicitly, but it implied risk. In institutional language, implication was enough. Once assigned, the label followed him everywhere. Agencies treated him with procedural caution rather than evaluation. Forms required additional disclosures. Reviews were scheduled with heightened scrutiny. The system did not need to explain its suspicion. The classification justified it. Daniel began to notice subtle changes. Background checks triggered delays. Routine verifications stalled. Professional opportunities hesitated without explanation. The system had not intended to punish him beyond the scope of the case, yet its reach extended automatically. A label, once entered, did not respect boundaries. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Daniel found himself anticipating skepticism before it appeared. He became careful with language, aware that misinterpretation could reinforce assumptions already embedded in his file. The burden was no longer proving stability. It was disproving implication. The longer the separation persisted, the more the label appeared validated. Continuity created legitimacy. What had begun as precaution hardened into presumption. The system interpreted persistence as confirmation. Challenging the classification became increasingly difficult, not because evidence was lacking, but because time had reshaped perception. Internally, the case was marked as progressing appropriately. Compliance metrics were satisfied. Oversight boxes were checked. No alarms were raised because the system had functioned as designed. Accuracy was assumed because procedure had been followed. Behind the scenes, performance pressures influenced the pace. Cases categorized as higher risk were prioritized. Expedited handling improved throughput statistics. Daniel's case moved quickly through initial stages without full contextual review. Speed was rewarded. Accuracy was secondary. Daniel did not yet know this, but his case had been accelerated not solely for protection, but for efficiency. The label assigned to him did more than shape perception. It optimized workflow. As Daniel continued to submit documentation, employment records, medical explanations, community references, he assumed these materials would alter the system's understanding. They were acknowledged and scheduled for later review. The distinction between immediate action and subsequent evaluation allowed the system to defer correction indefinitely. Fairness was promised in the future, while harm persisted in the present. The emotional toll deepened. The routines that had defined Daniel's life collapsed. Absence replaced structure. Trust evaporated as he realized how little visibility he had into decisions governing his family. Authority remained distant and abstract. There was no individual to appeal to directly, no moment of explanation. The badge represented a role, not a person. Daniel began to understand the nature of the power that had intervened. It was not malicious, but it was absolute. It valued speed over certainty. Most critically, it treated compliance as evidence of guilt. The absence of resistance was interpreted as confirmation, further entrenching the decision. Correction, Daniel slowly realized, was not the system's priority. Continuity was. Procedure had replaced humanity, and humanity had no formal appeal. For months, nothing changed. The separation persisted. Reviews were scheduled, rescheduled, and deferred. Daniel complied with every requirement placed before him, believing that cooperation would lead to correction. The system acknowledged his participation without reconsidering its foundation. Progress was measured through completion, not truth. What Daniel did not know was that the foundation of his case rested on an assumption that had never been verified. The discovery did not begin as an investigation. It began as routine maintenance. An internal quality reviewer, assigned to audit procedural compliance rather than outcomes, accessed Daniel's file as part of a standard verification process. The task was narrow and mechanical. Confirm that codes matched categories. Confirm that forms aligned with policy. Nothing more was expected. The file appeared complete at first glance. It contained assessments, summaries, and judicial authorization. Everything necessary to justify the outcome seemed present, yet buried within the administrative layers was a discrepancy so small it had survived unquestioned. A risk classification code had been applied that did not correspond with the supporting documentation. The reviewer paused. The code assigned to Daniel's case triggered expedited judicial handling and reduced evidentiary thresholds. It was reserved for situations involving imminent danger. Yet nothing in the file described urgency. The records referenced logistical gaps, not threats. There were no allegations of harm, no emergency indicators. The system had elevated probability into certainty without substantiation. Tracing the classification backward revealed the origin. During intake, under pressure to process volume, a default risk category had been selected. The choice was not malicious, it was efficient. The system rewarded completion over clarification. That single selection altered the legal pathway entirely. Once entered, the code propagated forward. Supervisors trusted it. Legal liaisons relied on it. Judicial officials accepted it as validated truth. Each stage assumed the previous one had verified accuracy. No mechanism existed to challenge the input without slowing throughput. Correction created friction. Friction was discouraged. The system did not flag the inconsistency because it was not designed to. Compliance was measured by adherence to process, not by alignment between input and reality. The mistake survived because no one was incentivized to look or it. The reviewer understood the implications immediately. Correcting the classification would require reopening a case already justified through judicial authority. It would expose procedural weakness. It would raise questions about oversight. More importantly, it would challenge decisions protected by official badges. Institutional pressure followed, though never explicitly. The reviewer was reminded of audit scope limitations. Emphasis was placed on policy alignment rather than reinterpretation. The discrepancy was framed as discretionary. Authority had acted within its perceived rights. Revisiting that action risked undermining confidence in the system. Yet the error remained. It had consequences. It had reshaped Daniel's life. And ignoring it meant accepting those consequences as justified. The reviewer faced a dilemma common to large systems. Neutrality was expected. Disruption was not. Careers advanced through alignment, not challenge. Reporting the error formally would trigger defensive mechanisms. The system would likely contextualize the mistake as harmless, emphasizing outcome over origin. Responsibility would diffuse. Correction would stall. Still, the evidence was clear. Before access to the file could be further restricted, the reviewer made a quiet decision. Relevant documents were preserved outside the active system, not for exposure, not for retaliation. For accountability, documentation, once removed from institutional control, could not be quietly altered. Soon after, access to Daniel's file was locked pending review. The action was described as procedural housekeeping. Its timing was not questioned, but its meaning was unmistakable. Authority respond to vulnerability by tightening control, not by correcting error. No formal acknowledgement of the discrepancy occurred. No correction was issued. The mistake remained unaddressed, but it was no longer invisible. It now existed in two places, buried within the system and preserved outside it. For Daniel, nothing changed immediately. Separation continued. Procedures advanced. The system moved forward as if nothing had happened. Yet beneath the surface, the foundation of the case had fractured. A single administrative error, once unquestioned, now threatened the authority that depended on it. What made this moment pivotal was not exposure, but preservation. The truth had been secured, waiting for a moment when it could no longer be ignored. Authority could delay, deny, and deflect, but it could not erase what had been copied. The file that governed Daniel's fate was no longer entirely under institutional control. Systems built on certainty are deeply unsettled by uncertainty they cannot contain. The first sign that the system felt threatened was not confrontation, but coordination. When requests for sealed records began to arrive from outside oversight bodies, authority responded instinctively. Leadership convened quickly, framing the situation not as a question of accuracy, but as a matter of institutional stability. The language shifted. What had once been described as a potential discrepancy was now referred to as an acceptable interpretation within policy boundaries. Error was redefined as discretion. Internal communications emphasized unity. Staff were reminded to avoid speculation and to route inquiries through designated channels. Confidence in prior decisions was reiterated. Silence was not demanded, but it was encouraged. In large systems, expectation does not need to be spoken to be understood. Procedural defenses followed. Access to Daniel Brooks's case was further restricted under the justification of privacy protection. Review timelines were extended, described as due diligence rather than delay. Each extension bought time. Time allowed narratives to align. Alignment reduced risk. Authority understood that momentum favored it. Prolonged processes exhaust scrutiny. Complexity obscures clarity. Dense documentation discourages challenge. The system relied on these dynamics not maliciously, but reflexively. Preservation of legitimacy became the priority. Within departments, alignment became performance. Informal discussion diminished. Oversight narrowed. The internal reviewer who had preserved the file felt the shift immediately. Audit assignments changed. Scope was reduced. The message was implicit but unmistakable. Disruption would not be rewarded. The reviewer was not accused of wrongdoing. Instead, professionalism was redefined as neutrality. Neutrality in this context meant non-interference. The system did not punish dissent openly. It rendered it irrelevant. For Daniel, the effects were devastating. The possibility of correction, briefly visible, faded again. Compliance requirements increased. Additional assessments were scheduled. Parenting evaluations, supervised observations, and procedural milestones multiplied. Each new requirement diverted attention from the foundational error. Authority maintained the appearance of action while avoiding the core issue. Leadership prepared its narrative carefully. If exposure became unavoidable, the mistake would be framed as minor and non-determinative. Emphasis would be placed on the child's best interest, a phrase powerful enough to override procedural critique. Moral language often outlives factual challenge. Externally, auditors persisted. Their requests became more precise, narrowing scope to prevent obstruction. The system responded with partial disclosures, curated to demonstrate cooperation without conceding fault. Selective transparency preserved control while projecting compliance. Internally, disagreements surfaced quietly. Some officials recognized the fragility of the defense. The preserved documentation, if examined fully, would reveal how the misclassification influenced judicial authorization. Others argued that acknowledging error would undermine confidence in the entire system. The debate exposed competing values, integrity versus continuity. Authority favored continuity. The emotional toll on Daniel intensified. Extended separation compounded the sense of injustice. Procedure without correction felt punitive, regardless of intent. Authority framed patience as responsibility, yet patience demanded endurance from those with the least power to bear it. As weeks passed, the system's posture hardened. Daniel's case became emblematic internally, a test of whether authority could withstand scrutiny without concession. Closing ranks was no longer defensive, it was existential. To admit error would be to question the reliability of the badge itself. What leadership underestimated was the resilience of documentation. The preserved file existed beyond institutional reach. Its contents contradicted the official narrative with specificity and time. Stamps. Authority could delay and reframe, but it could not reconcile that contradiction without acknowledgement. When auditors requested a formal reconciliation meeting, escalation became unavoidable. Legal counsel advised caution. Cooperation was recommended. Transparency was avoided. The distinction mattered. Cooperation allowed control. Transparency surrendered it. For Daniel, the moment was both hopeful and terrifying. The possibility of truth emerging carried risk, of further delay, of retaliation, of procedural backlash. Yet the alternative had already exacted too high a cost. Silence was no longer survivable. The system closed ranks because it believed unity equaled safety. It did not yet understand that unity built on error collapses under scrutiny. The preserved file, the auditor's persistence, and the widening gap between narrative and record were converging. Authority had delayed exposure as long as it could. Now it faced a choice it had tried to avoid. The reconciliation meeting marked a shift the system could no longer control. External auditors arrived with documentation, timelines, and statutory authority that neutralized institutional defenses. This was not a public trial, yet it carried comparable weight. Assumptions once protected by badges and titles now required justification. The system, accustomed to directing scrutiny outward, was forced to confront it inward. Oversight demanded alignment between records, decisions, and outcomes. The misclassification at the center of Daniel Brooks's case was no longer abstract. It was traced across procedural stages, mapped from intake to judicial authorization. One administrative input had cascaded forward without verification, transforming assumption into legal directive. Authority attempted minimization. Officials emphasized discretion. They argued that the system had acted within policy. The auditors rejected this framing. Their mandate concerned process integrity, not reputational preservation. They demonstrated how expedited handling bypassed safeguards, how timelines prioritized throughput, and how oversight mechanisms failed to flag inconsistencies. The error was no longer defensible as isolated. Judicial officials responded cautiously. Their authority depended on the integrity of what was presented to them. Acknowledging reliance on incomplete information threatened not just one ruling, but confidence in the system's protective framework. The badge that symbolized impartiality now represented vulnerability. For the first time, Daniel's experience was contextualized as consequence rather than exception. His separation was no longer framed as unfortunate necessity, but as the result of procedural failure. This reframing altered the posture of review. Authority was no longer protecting a child from risk, it was protecting itself from accountability. Internally, resistance softened into recalibration. Legal counsel advised cooperation to limit exposure. Selective acknowledgement replaced denial. The system prepared to concede error without assigning responsibility. Correction was acceptable. Blame was not. Daniel's credibility shifted. What had once been dismissed as emotional reaction was now corroborated by documentation. The preserved file supported his account with specificity. His role changed subtly. He was no longer merely the subject of procedure. He became evidence of IT's failure. Oversight expanded its scope. Additional cases were sampled. Patterns emerged, similar classifications, similar expedited handling, similar reliance on incomplete review. The issue was no longer singular. It was systemic. Efficiency-driven decision-making had replaced deliberation across multiple cases. Public exposure loomed, though it remained measured. Oversight reports were prepared for official record. Their language was restrained, but their implications were profound. Authority understood that once these findings existed formally, narrative control would erode. For Daniel, resolution remained slow. Recognition did not restore proximity. Justice mediated through systems moves cautiously, even when error is clear. Yet the direction had changed. The system was no longer closing ranks. It was repositioning itself. Judicial review tightened. Standards were revised. Questions were asked that had previously been assumed away. Authority adjusted behavior not through moral awakening but through consequence. Oversight reshaped practice where empathy had not. When the ruling was finally issued, it arrived without spectacle. It acknowledged procedural error, incomplete review, and misapplied classification standards. The language corrected the record without condemning the institution. Authority resolved the matter administratively. Custody was restored. Daniel was informed that the conditions justifying separation no longer applied. Supervision would remain temporarily, designed to phase out. On paper, the system had worked. In reality, months of separation had already altered trust, routine, and emotional stability. The institution moved quickly to close the CAS. E-records were updated, classifications revised, oversight requirements marked as fulfilled. Public statements emphasized reform and learning, carefully avoiding personal narrative. Authority measured success through correction, not repair. Daniel did not experience relief as celebration. It arrived gradually, layered beneath exhaustion and disbelief. Time lost did not return through acknowledgement. Justice corrected the present, but it could not reclaim the past. Officials involved faced quiet professional consequences. Reassignments, reduced authority, expanded oversight. No public reckoning followed. Accountability was administrative, not moral. Authority adapted without fully confronting its behavior. Internally, culture shifted subtly. Documentation was scrutinized, decisions slowed, caution replaced confidence. The system learned restraint through surveillance rather than reflection. Incentives favoring speed remained, moderated but not removed. Daniel's case became reference material. Policies were revised using language shaped by his experience. Training incorporated lessons without naming him. His suffering informed reform, though his identity remained absent. Institutions absorb lessons without honoring those who paid for them. As life resumed, Daniel understood something the system never recorded. Authority does not equate to justice. Justice requires vigilance, skepticism, and persistence. It depends on someone noticing a mistake and refusing to ignore it. The internal reviewer who preserved the file remained unnamed. Their action was institutionalized and anonymized. Courage was absorbed into policy, stripped of identity. Dissent survived, but only in abstract CT form. The case closed on paper, its implications did not. The system returned to routine, carrying reform without reflection. Authority continued, constrained but intact. Correction did not require apology. Restoration did not require accountability. Harm became historical reference rather than moral burden. Daniel moved forward with his child, carrying knowledge earned at great cost. The system moved forward, carrying procedure. And the question that remained was not whether justice had arrived for Daniel. It was how many other families never discovered the error that took everything from them, simply because no one ever looked closely enough.